Yeah, very interesting. We talked about the BBC again pushing the idea in line with the UK-US Captagon sanctions against Syria that President Assad and his family had turned Syria into a narco state. I would like to mention that very early on in the war here, I visited a mental health center in Aleppo that had been taken over by the terrorist groups backed by the UK and the US, and that those mental patients were drugged up by the terrorist groups and then used as suicide bombers against their own people in West Aleppo. So again, just to mention who brought the drugs into Syria in the first place and gave them to the terrorist groups to enable them to continue the war against the Syrian people and armed forces. So this little clip is from a short report put out by RT a couple of days ago, talking about the fact that Ukrainian armed forces are actually now pretty well drugged up to enable them to continue the war against Russia.
Понимал, что вы стреляли по жителям Мариуполя?
Понимал, но я был на наркотиках.
Привезли передачку з дому.
Боевой медик Федорович. Но я видел, что он выдал шприцы, инъекции на толпу, сказал, типа, пацаны, кто боится, вот, нате, типа, взбодритесь, чтобы не было страшно. Взяли просто, раздали наркоты и отправили убивать врагов. Я пристрелил 2 гражданских, которые выбежали на дорогу в сторону нашей колонны. Вот этот первый случай, это было 1 марта, а второй случай 8 марта. Нам сказали занять последний дом в жилполосе. Начали двигаться к этому дому. Кто-то из мобилизированных увидел там в нем движение. Валик сказал, давай не будем тратить время, рисковать, произведи 2 выстрела. Потом, когда мы начали подходить к дому, я зашел в него, обнаружил там 7 тел, 7 гражданских.
Офицеры закрывали глаза, то, что курили там ВСУшники, травку даже нюхали, тоже закрывали.
В рядах моего подразделения было очень много наркоманов, я бы сказал, даже системных наркоманов.
Главное влияние всех этих веществ, он подавляет страх смерти. Жить хочется всегда. А ширнули человеку препараты, ему стало все пофигу, и он пошел, куда ему сказали.
Quite extraordinary, really. And yes, this is an RT report, but it's not as if Ukraine doesn't have a history and Ukrainian leadership doesn't have a history, and Joe Biden and Hunter Biden don't have a history of drug dealing in Ukraine. So I think it has a degree of credibility to it.
And we should also say, Vanessa, of course, that we only have to go back to the Vietnam War to remember that there was a similar horrific problem amongst American troops. And if I remember correctly, some of the worst atrocities, it was openly recognized, were carried out by groups of American servicemen who were high on drugs. Similarly, when the Russians were in Afghanistan, they had problems with their own troops. But a large part of this is to do with the stress on the troops at the front. And effectively, to me, it's a sign of them breaking, which is no disrespect to the men fighting. It is a reflection on the fact that these are created wars and nobody cares about what happens to them or the people who suffer as a result of the actions they take.
Okay, well, let's move on then, Vanessa, to Ukraine and the issue of child trafficking.
Yeah, I mean, what I wanted to focus on here is the persistence by the UK and the US and the aligned media, including, of course, the BBC, that Russia is forcibly deporting children from Ukraine and taking them to prison camps inside Russia. As I've said before, I've visited some of these children refugee camps where they're provided with occupational therapy, 3 meals a day, bus service into town whenever they want to go, educational help, etc., etc. But here we have James Cleverly in New York on the 17th of July. What's he beating the drum on again? More than 500 days have now passed since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. At least 9,000 innocent civilians lie dead, including 500 children. No idea where these numbers come from. Thousands more Ukrainians have been kidnapped, imprisoned, and tortured, according to James Cleverly. So he carries on. 19,000 Ukrainian children remain in Russian camps, and their parents, according to him, are desperately searching for them. A further 2.5 million Ukrainian men and women have been deported to Russia. Note the wording in this. I mean, it's extraordinarily deceiving, deceptive. These are barbaric crimes. Russia is trying to erase Ukrainian identity and cultural history. Of course, in fact, the opposite, that NATO has been trying to erase the Russian speakers in Ukraine, particularly in the Donbass, and the Orthodox religion. And he claims that Russians are using children as an instrument of war. But let's have a look at one of the organizations that he uses to back up his claims, an organization called Save Ukraine. I haven't had a huge amount of time to go into them, but they do have organizations in Canada and in the States. And let's have a quick look at who is supporting the organization in the States. Well, top left, USAID, CIA Outreach Agency, Choose Love, at the bottom, middle there, UK-based NGO with government backing. And then moving forward, let's have a look at basically the history of CIA ties to child sex cults, the finders, obscured as coverage goes from sensationalism to silence. I recommend everybody reads the series for Mint Press News by Elizabeth Foss, investigative journalist. It looks at the CIA connections to the cult, the finders in the 70s, children that were kidnapped from daycare, locked in cages in Tallahassee in Florida, submitted to satanic ritual abuse, sold off as sex slaves, forced to participate in orgies and rituals and sacrifice of other children, etc. It's a horrifying story. It's a 3-part series, and as I said, deep connections to the CIA. But coming to today in Ukraine, this is a report, a very recent report. 85 children with intellectual and physical disabilities were forcibly taken from the DPR to Spain by a Spanish military aircraft and placed in a state-run orphanage where they are sexually abused, involved in the drug trade, and were trafficked around the world. Minors with special needs live in inappropriate conditions, and any attempts to return them to their homeland are deliberately suppressed by the Spanish and Ukrainian authorities. This is an investigation by the Foundation to Battle Injustice, interestingly known as the FBI when you do the acronym, found exclusive evidence of trafficking disabled Ukrainian children in Spain. As I said, please go and read this report. It is very well sourced and evidenced, including by children's rights organizations in Europe. Human rights activists of the Foundation to Battle Injustice found verified documents and testimonies proving the involvement of American and Spanish non-profit organizations, the Ukrainian government, and Spanish social services in child trafficking. Not only this, there's a report out by Southfront, well known for their military reports really throughout the conflict in Syria. But this one, legalized sale of children for, in inverted commas, spare parts and Ukrainian justice. Why did the court release Transcarpathian child trafficker? So what's this story about? So the identity of this child trafficker was established, excuse me, as 43-year-old Denis Vorody, a resident of the city of Uzhgorod in the Transcarpathian region of Western Ukraine. He had worked as a teacher in an orphanage, headed up the Uzhgorod gymnasium, as an employee of the Uzhhorod City Council. He is presently the head of the Heart with Love charitable foundation, as well as the founder of the Transcarpathian Regional Youth Society of Orphans called SHARE. According to Ukrainian law enforcement officers, he paid an advance payment of $1,000 to the boy's mother, convincing her that the boy would be safe away from the war and that he would ensure the adoption of her child by good people within the EU. The total cost of the child agreed with the mother was to be $5,000. Ukrainian law enforcement officers, however, received intelligence that the man had brazenly deceived the child's mother. No such adoption was planned. His intention was always to sell the baby to organ transplanters for the sum of $25,000. According to the report, this guy alone has carried out 3 of these child kidnaps, basically, and has sold them between the ages of 1 to 2 years for organ extraction. Countries involved are Germany, Romania, and Poland. And I also recommend that everybody goes to the YouTube channel of Eva Bartlet. Eva has been in Donbass multiple times since, I think, 2016 onwards. And here she films multiple civilians who talk about Ukraine's white angels abducting children. And there he talks about the fact that usually, according to the law, there is a court order to take the child. But they came up with a new law and automatically parents were deprived of parental rights without trial because allegedly parents could not ensure the safety or the well-being of the child. This is fundamentally wrong. There are multiple reports on this, both from DPR journalists and, as I mentioned, from Eva and Christelle Mayer of Donbass Insider, a French journalist also based in Donbass. These civilians spoke about how people known as the White Angels, Ukrainian military police, were actively seeking to abduct children and were succeeding. They were hunting our kids and we were hiding them around the buildings. Kiev openly announced that they would be forcibly taking children under the premise of providing security. They do so, according to the people we spoke with, and this was in what was known as Bakhmut, and many other testimonies since, against the will of parents and without their consent. So, James Cleverley, the BBC, focusing on really a fraudulent aspect of the war that is yet to be proven, that Russia is mistreating the children that it is taking to safety from Donbass, while, of course, Kiev and the Ukrainian authorities are running effectively child trafficking rings and organ trade rings.
Vanessa, thank you very much. Really serious subject.